Her world changed the day a rugged mountain man touched her face and promised protection. Never having felt the gentle caress of romance before, she found herself caught between fear and an unfamiliar longing that stirred within her soul. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The blizzard raged with unforgiving fury across Pine Hollow, transforming the mountain village into a ghostly landscape of white. Snow piled against doorways, smothering the usual sounds of life and commerce, leaving only the mournful howl of wind threading between cabins. John Smith stood at his window, watching the storm with the practiced eye of a man who had survived many winters alone. His calloused hands gripped a mug of steaming pine needle tea, the only comfort in his solitary existence at the edge of the forest. The sudden thump against his door came just as dusk was settling. John tensed, unused to visitors, even in fair weather. Opening the heavy wooden door, he found a crumpled form on his porch, a young woman, half buried in snow, her clothing inadequate against the mountain's wrath. "Good Lord," he muttered, kneeling beside her. Her face was marked with angry red patches where the ice had bitten into her skin. Her hands, raw and blistered, spoke of a desperate journey. Yet when her eyes fluttered open, John was struck by the dignity in them, a fierce determination that even the merciless cold couldn't extinguish. Without hesitation, the hermit gathered her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. Inside his cabin, the fire cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn walls as John gently laid her near the hearth. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blanket, the one he'd traded 3 months' worth of goat cheese to acquire from a passing merchant last autumn. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. The woman didn't respond, her eyes following his movements with wary exhaustion. John moved to his modest kitchen area, hanging a cast-iron pot over the flames. Into it went dried venison, preserved root vegetables, and herbs Martha Davis had pressed upon him during her last visit. For when the joints ache, the village healer had insisted, though they both knew it was her way of checking he hadn't frozen to death in his self-imposed isolation. As the stew began to simmer, filling the cabin with rich aroma, John settled on a stool across from his unexpected guest. The wind rattled the shutters, as if demanding entry, but inside, an unexpected calm had settled. The hermit studied the woman's face, noting the delicate curve of her jaw, the strength in her shoulders despite her weakened state. What desperate circumstance had driven her into the teeth of such a storm? And why, of all the dwellings in and around Pine Hollow, had fate delivered her to his door? The one man who had sworn never again to entangle himself in the affairs of others? "Sarah Johnson," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling pine logs in the hearth. John Smith leaned forward slightly, catching not just her name but the delicate tremor that ran through her words, a mixture of fear and fragile hope that made his chest tighten. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face, illuminating the raw redness of her cheeks where the bitter mountain wind had left its mark. John noticed how she kept her eyes downcast, her fingers trembling as they stretched toward the warmth of the flames. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The hermit wasn't accustomed to conversation, having spent years in solitude at the edge of Pine Hollow. He poured a bowl of steaming stew and placed it before her, the aroma of herbs and root vegetables filling the small cabin. Sarah barely touched the food, though her body clearly craved nourishment. She took small, hesitant sips, as if afraid to accept too much kindness. The bruises on her hands and face told a story of hardship that John didn't yet understand, but recognized all too well. "The storm won't pass for days," he explained, moving to add another log to the fire. "The path to the village will be impassable." Her shoulders tensed at the mention of the village, a reaction that didn't escape his notice. John had his own reasons for keeping distance from the other residents of Pine Hollow, preferring the company of his goats and the silence of the woods to the suspicious glances and whispered judgments. "I don't need the village," she murmured, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes held a dignity that surprised him, a quiet strength beneath her obvious exhaustion. John nodded, understanding more than she realized. He moved to the window, watching the relentless snow build against the panes. The isolation that had been his choice was now their shared circumstance. "While you're under my roof," he said, turning back to face her, his voice low and fierce with unexpected protectiveness. "No harm will come to you. That's my promise." Sarah's hands stilled around the bowl. For a moment, something like trust flickered across her features, so brief he might have imagined it. She nodded once, a silent acceptance of his vow. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, but within, a fragile peace had been established between two strangers brought together by circumstance and storm. John returned to his chair, settling into the comfortable silence, wondering what forces had driven this woman to his door and why he felt so certain that her arrival would change everything. In the days that followed, John Smith established a routine with his unexpected guest. Each morning, as dawn broke over the snow-laden pines, he would demonstrate the skills needed to survive the harsh mountain winter. Sarah Johnson proved to be a quick study, her delicate hands soon growing calloused as she learned to split kindling with precise, powerful strokes. "Hold the axe like this," John instructed, his gruff voice softening when she successfully cleaved a log in two. The hermit showed surprising patience, guiding her through the process of collecting snowmelt for drinking water, explaining how to test its purity before storing it in the wooden buckets he'd carved years ago. Sarah's silence began to thaw like the icicles that hung from the cabin's eaves. She would hum softly while working, and occasionally, when John said something unexpectedly kind, a smile would transform her bruised face. One afternoon, as they patched a section of the roof damaged by heavy snow, she even laughed when he nearly slipped on the icy shingles. "I haven't done that since I was a boy," he admitted, steadying himself with a weathered hand. The goats in their pen seemed to take to Sarah immediately. The animals, usually skittish around strangers, would press their cold noses against her palms as she fed them. John watched from the doorway as she spoke to them in hushed tones, words he couldn't quite catch but recognized as gentle reassurances. Meanwhile, Pine Hollow buzzed with suspicion. At the smithy, Robert Brown hammered metal with unusual force, his face dark with disapproval as he spread tales about the recluse and his mysterious companion. "No good will come of it," the blacksmith declared to anyone who would listen. "That man has always kept to himself, and now he brings an outsider into our midst during the worst winter in memory?" The whispers traveled from the forge to the weaving hall, where women gathered to work and talk. Martha Davis, measuring herbs in the corner, listened carefully but offered no judgment. The healer had known John since he was a child and understood his solitary nature better than most. "Perhaps she needed shelter," Martha suggested quietly, and he was kind enough to provide it. Her words fell on deaf ears. By nightfall, speculation had reached Elder Thomas, who frowned deeply at the news. The village, already isolated by the brutal weather, grew more insular in its thinking. What did this strange woman's arrival mean for their community? And why had the mountain man, who had sworn off human connection years ago, chosen to break his solitude for her? In John's cabin, oblivious to the growing unease in the village, Sarah tended the fire while he prepared a simple stew. Their companionable silence, a stark contrast to the storm of gossip brewing beyond their walls. The midsummer fire dance glowed at the heart of Pine Hollow, transforming the village square into a tapestry of golden light and dancing shadows. Sarah Johnson stood at the periphery, her slender frame half hidden behind an ancient oak as she observed the celebration with curious eyes. Villagers moved in rhythmic circles around the bonfire, their faces illuminated by flames that reached toward the darkening sky. John Smith noticed her hesitation and moved quietly to her side. "You can join them," he said, his voice barely audible above the music of wooden flutes and hand-carved drums. "I wouldn't know the steps," she replied, fingers nervously twisting the hem of her borrowed dress. The celebration reached its peak as Elder Thomas raised his gnarled hands for silence. The white-haired man, respected and feared in equal measure, called out in a voice that carried across the square, "Join hands, neighbors! Circle the fire and bless our coming harvest." Villagers formed a ring, clasping hands and beginning the traditional dance. Elder Thomas spotted Sarah lingering at the edge and beckoned imperiously. "You there, outsider, will you not honor our ways?" All eyes turned to her, and Sarah's cheeks flushed with unwelcome attention. "I cannot," she admitted, her voice carrying unexpected strength despite her discomfort. "I've never taken part in such a rite." A shocked murmur rippled through the gathering. Robert Brown, the blacksmith, snorted derisively. "She doesn't belong here," he muttered loudly enough for others to hear. "Doesn't even know the most basic traditions." Martha Davis shot the blacksmith a disapproving look before stepping from the circle. The healer approached Sarah with an outstretched hand. "There's always time to learn," she offered kindly. John moved protectively closer to Sarah, his tall figure casting a long shadow. The hermit rarely attended village gatherings, and his presence beside the mysterious woman sparked whispers among the onlookers. He didn't speak, but his stance communicated clearly. She was under his protection. Elder Thomas observed this silent challenge with narrowed eyes. "Our ways have preserved Pine Hollow for generations," he proclaimed. "Those who seek shelter here must respect them." As the night deepened, lanterns swung gently between the fir trees surrounding the square, casting their warm glow over the festivities. Sarah eventually accepted Martha's invitation to watch from a closer vantage point, though she declined to join the dance itself. Her quiet dignity in the face of scrutiny stirred something in the village. Discomfort in some, curiosity in others. The old order of Pine Hollow, built on isolation and tradition, felt the first tremors of change as Sarah's presence forced them to confront an outsider's gaze upon their customs. The first frost painted the valley white as autumn's final days surrendered to winter's approach. A devastating rockslide thundered down the mountainside, burying the main road beneath tons of jagged stone and uprooted trees. Pine Hollow found itself completely isolated, cut off from neighboring settlements and the traders who brought vital supplies. John Smith watched from his cabin porch as villagers gathered in anxious clusters, their voices carrying on the crisp air. Food stores dwindled quickly, and the communal granary keeper announced stricter rationing. The blacksmith, Robert, took to eyeing Sarah with undisguised suspicion whenever they ventured into the village, whispering to others as they passed. "They'll blame the outsider first," John told her one evening, stoking the hearth fire higher against the growing chill. "People get dangerous when they're hungry." Sarah nodded, her fingers working nimbly at mending a torn shirt. "Then we must make sure we don't go hungry." The hermit doubled his efforts to ensure their survival, rising before dawn to check his traps. He taught Sarah to set snares using twisted sinew and bent branches, showing her how to place them along the narrow deer paths that wound through the frosted undergrowth. Her hands, once raw from exposure, grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. "See these tracks?" he asked, crouching beside a set of delicate impressions in the thin snow. "A doe passed here not 2 hours ago. Notice how the front prints are slightly longer?" Sarah knelt beside him, her breath clouding in the cold air as she studied the signs. She learned quickly, memorizing the subtle differences between rabbit and fox prints, between fresh tracks and old. Back at the cabin, they developed a quiet rhythm. She tended the goats while he skinned whatever game they'd caught. Evenings brought them together by the fire, sharing simple meals of root vegetables and meat, speaking little but finding comfort in the silence. Martha Davis visited occasionally, bringing herbs and news from the village. "Robert's been filling Elder Thomas's ear with talk," the healer warned. "Says there's something unnatural about how quickly the girl's taken to mountain ways." John merely nodded, unsurprised. "And what do you think?" Martha's weathered face creased in a smile as she glanced toward Sarah. "I think some souls recognize where they belong, even if they don't know why." As autumn deepened, so did the bond between the cabin's occupants. They found unexpected joy in small victories, a successful hunt, a repaired roof that didn't leak, the warmth of the hearth on bitter nights. Outside their walls, rumors continued to swirl like dead leaves in the wind, but inside, something fragile and precious was taking root. The cabin grew warm as evening shadows stretched across the floor. Sarah Johnson knelt by the hearth, her slender fingers working methodically with the broom made of bound twigs. As she swept away the day's ashes, a melody rose from her lips, soft at first, then gaining strength as she lost herself in the rhythm of her work. John paused at the doorway, a bundle of kindling in his arms. The tune struck him like a physical blow. It was the Lullaby of Stones, a song mothers in these mountains had sung to their children for generations, a melody no lowlander would know. His grandmother had hummed it to him as a child, whispering that the song belonged only to those born under the shadow of these peaks. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked, setting down the wood with careful deliberation. Sarah's hands stilled. Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps fear, before she composed herself. "What song?" she asked, her voice deliberately light. "The one you were just singing. It's known only to people from these mountains." "I must have heard it somewhere in my travels," she said with a shrug, returning to her sweeping. "I've never lived in these parts before." "Perhaps a traveler sang it at an inn where I stayed." The hermit studied her face in the firelight, noting how she avoided his gaze. Her fingers, once raw from exposure, had healed well under his care, yet still bore calluses that spoke of a life of labor. She handled mountain tools with the ease of someone born to them, not like an outsider learning new ways. "The melody carries secrets," John said quietly. "Mountain mothers claim it protects children from winter spirits." Sarah smiled faintly. "It's just a pretty tune." Later, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew, John noticed how she arranged the wooden bowls exactly as his mother once had. The spoons aligned to the right, the cups placed just so. These were not the habits of a lowlander. The mystery of her past deepened with each passing day. Who was this woman who knew mountain ways yet denied her heritage? What had driven her to flee to his doorstep during the worst blizzard in years? John found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The graceful way she moved, how she seemed to understand the language of the mountains without being taught. Questions burned in his mind, but he held them back, fearing that pressing too hard might drive her away. Despite his confusion, he could not deny the warmth that had taken root in his heart, a feeling he had fought long dead after years of solitude. Whatever secrets Sarah carried, they mattered less than the light she had brought back into his lonely world. The village forge glowed with fierce orange light as Robert Brown hammered a horseshoe into shape. The blacksmith paused mid-strike when Sarah Johnson entered, her presence unexpected in his domain of fire and iron. She moved quietly among his finished pieces, displayed on rough wooden shelves, her fingers hovering over the metalwork with unusual interest. "Can I help you with something?" Robert asked, his voice deliberately gruff. He'd heard enough about John Smith's mysterious guest to fuel his suspicion. Sarah smiled politely. "These patterns are beautiful," she said, tracing a spiral design etched into a decorative door hinge. Her fingertip followed the curve with practiced ease, as though the symbol spoke to her in some private language. The blacksmith set down his hammer and approached. "Most folks just see metal," he observed, studying her face. "Those marks are just for show." "They're protection symbols," Sarah replied without thinking. "This one keeps evil spirits from crossing the threshold." She pointed to another piece. "And this one ensures good fortune for a new home." Robert's eyes narrowed. Only those born in the mountain villages knew these meanings. knowledge passed through generations of isolated communities. He'd learned them from his grandfather, who'd warned that outsiders should never be taught their significance. "Where did you say you were from?" he asked sharply. Sarah stepped back, suddenly aware of her mistake. I must have seen something similar somewhere," she stammered. Later that evening, Robert sat heavily at the village tavern, his ale untouched, as he spoke in hushed tones to a cluster of locals. "She knew the old markings," he insisted. "The ones our grandparents carved to ward off mountain curses." "Perhaps John taught her," suggested a farmer. Robert scoffed. "That hermit barely speaks to anyone. Besides, he's not mountain-born himself." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I think she's from one of the cursed bloodlines, the ones our ancestors drove out generations ago." The whispers spread through Pine Hollow like smoke, seeping under doorways and through cracked windows. By morning, mothers were drawing protective signs in flour across their thresholds, and men exchanged meaningful glances when John passed by with firewood. The blacksmith watched from his forge as the hermit and Sarah crossed the village square together. His resentment burned hotter than his furnace. John had always kept to himself, refusing to join village celebrations or contribute to community projects. Now he'd brought an outsider with suspicious knowledge into their midst. "If they won't drive them out," Robert muttered to himself, striking his anvil with unnecessary force, "perhaps they'll drive themselves away." The metal sparked beneath his hammer, each blow fueling his determination to reclaim Pine Hollow's isolation, and perhaps win back the respect John had never bothered to earn. Winter descended upon Pine Hollow with merciless fury. The first blizzard arrived without warning, burying the village beneath 6 feet of snow overnight. Ice sealed cabin doors shut, and even the bravest hunters retreated from the woods as temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling depths. In John Smith's cabin at the forest's edge, survival became a daily battle. Each morning, he would force the door open against mounting snowdrifts, venturing out only to feed the goats huddled together in their pen for warmth. Sarah Johnson helped him reinforce the roof with pine branches when the weight of snow threatened to collapse it. "My father taught me that hunger is just another kind of cold," Sarah whispered one evening as they rationed the last of their preserved meat. Her fingers, once raw from exposure, had grown stronger, though they still bore the marks of her journey. John nodded, adding another log to the hearth. "And both can be endured with the right companion." They huddled by the fire each night, wrapped in rough woolen blankets that Martha Davis had brought before the paths became impassable. The wind's howl became their constant companion, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the cabin walls. Yet within this cocoon of necessity, they found unexpected comfort. "Tell me about the lowlands," John asked one night, his voice barely audible above the storm. Sarah's eyes reflected the dancing flames as she described fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon. "Nothing like your mountains," she said. "No protection from the wind. But no walls to keep you in, either." The hermit studied her face in the firelight, noting how she never mentioned family or friends from her past. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, had even prided himself on needing no one. Yet as the winter deepened, he found himself quietly grateful for her presence. They developed rituals to combat the darkness. Sarah would sing softly while mending clothes by candlelight. John taught her to carve simple figures from pine wood. They shared stories, careful ones that revealed little of their wounds, but enough of their souls to forge understanding. When food grew scarce, they melted snow for broth and stretched their supplies with pine needle tea. The hunger gnawed at them, but they found strength in shared hardship. Sarah never complained, her resilience shining through the cold like a beacon. "We'll survive this," John promised one night when the storm reached its peak, the cabin creaking under nature's assault. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. "I know," she replied simply. Together they endured hunger, darkness, and the endless howl of winter, finding in their shared struggle something neither had expected: trust. The night had settled deep into the mountains, bringing with it a silence broken only by the occasional snap of burning pine. The blizzard had finally eased, leaving Pine Hollow buried beneath a pristine blanket of white. Inside John Smith's cabin, the firelight cast long shadows against the rough-hewn walls, illuminating the two figures huddled close to its warmth. Sarah Johnson sat cross-legged on the worn rug, her fingers absently tracing patterns in the wool. Her hair, usually tied back with a simple cord, fell loose around her shoulders, catching the golden light. For weeks now, they had shared this space, finding comfort in routine and quiet companionship, yet something unspoken hung between them. "I've never been kissed," she whispered suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could reclaim them. John looked up sharply from the knife he'd been sharpening, the whetstone going still in his hand. The hermit's eyes, usually guarded and watchful, widened with surprise. Her confession struck him with more force than any mountain storm, leaving him momentarily speechless. "Not ever?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah shook her head, a flush creeping across her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's heat. "Where I came from, tenderness wasn't." She trailed off, unable to finish. The revelation settled between them, fragile and significant. John set aside his work and moved closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His presence, solid and steady, had become her anchor in this strange new world. "Sarah," he said softly, using just her first name in a way that felt intimate. His calloused hand, weathered by years of solitary survival, reached out hesitantly. When she didn't pull away, he brushed his fingers against her cheek, tracing the fading marks left by her journey through the storm. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "I promise you," John said, his voice low and fierce with conviction, "no harm will come to you under my roof, not ever." The vow hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than either could fully comprehend. It wasn't just about physical safety anymore. It was about protection of something more fragile: trust, hope, possibility. Sarah leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I believe you," she whispered. From that moment, the cabin transformed. No longer merely a refuge from the cold, it became the fragile heart of something new and unspoken. The walls that had once sheltered a solitary man now held a different kind of warmth, one born of shared glances, careful touches, and words finally finding their way into the open. Outside, the winter wind continued its lonely song, but inside, something tender and unexpected had begun to bloom. The bitter winds of winter howled outside the cabin as Martha Davis trudged through knee-deep snow, her weathered hands clutching a basket of dried herbs. A village healer had begun making these journeys twice weekly, defying the treacherous conditions to reach John Smith's isolated home. "These will help with the chest congestion," Martha explained, showing Sarah Johnson how to crush juniper berries and mix them with pine resin. The older woman's eyes crinkled with approval as Sarah's nimble fingers quickly mastered the technique. Their lessons took place by the warmth of the hearth, where John would often sit quietly whittling or mending tools, pretending not to listen while absorbing every word. Martha brought not just medicine, but knowledge, stories of the mountain's healing plants, remedies passed down through generations, and techniques for setting bones and stitching wounds. "You have a natural gift," the healer remarked one evening, watching Sarah prepare a poultice for John's frostbitten fingers. "Your hands know what to do before your mind tells them." Sarah blushed at the praise, her confidence growing under Martha's tutelage. The cabin, once stark and utilitarian, now held bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and small clay pots of salves lining the shelves. During one particularly fierce blizzard, Martha was forced to stay the night. As John slept, The two women sat close to the dying embers, their voices hushed. "There's something familiar in your eyes," Martha whispered, studying Sarah's face in the firelight. "Something I haven't seen in these mountains for nearly 20 years." Sarah tensed, her fingers stilling on the herbs she was sorting. "I once knew a woman," the healer continued carefully, "who fled Pine Hollow with her newborn daughter. I helped them escape in the dead of winter." Martha's weathered hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. "She had your same determination, your same gentle strength." The revelation hung in the air between them, unacknowledged yet impossible to ignore. Martha didn't press further, but her gaze held questions and a hint of wonder. Could this young woman be that same child, returned to the mountains that had rejected her mother? The healer kept these thoughts to herself, knowing that such secrets carried weight. If Sarah truly was that lost child, Martha's past actions would soon demand a reckoning from the village elders who had driven the mother away. As dawn broke, Martha gathered her things to leave. She squeezed Sarah's hand with unexpected emotion. "You belong here," she said simply. Though whether she meant in the cabin, in Pine Hollow, or in the mountains themselves remained unclear. Sarah watched the healer disappear into the swirling snow, unaware that Martha carried away not just empty baskets, but growing certainty about a debt long unpaid. Snow fell in gentle waves outside the meeting hall as villagers huddled together for the winter vigil. The tradition of sharing tales of mountain spirits had been observed in Pine Hollow for generations, a way to honor the ancient forces that shaped their lives. Lantern light cast long shadows across weathered faces as Elder Thomas Wilson stood before the gathering, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light. Sarah Johnson sat beside John Smith near the back of the hall, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. She felt the weight of curious stares, but kept her gaze steady, determined not to show discomfort. The hermit's president, the healer, Martha Davis, shifted uncomfortably on her bench as the elder began recounting the legend of mountain brides, young women promised to the land through ancient rites to ensure prosperity and protection. "Outsiders cannot understand these bonds," Thomas continued, his voice growing heavier with each word. "They bring disruption to the balance we've maintained for centuries." Sarah felt John tense beside her. His hand found hers beneath the blanket. A silent gesture of support. "The spirits choose those who belong," the elder said pointedly, "and reject those who don't." A hush fell over the gathering. The blacksmith, Robert Brown, nodded vigorously from his place near the front, clearly pleased with the elder's thinly veiled accusation. Sarah rose slowly to her feet. "With respect, Elder Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "The mountains sheltered me when I had nowhere else to go. Perhaps the spirits you speak of are more welcoming than some who claim to honor them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had directly challenged the elder's authority in years. Thomas's face darkened. "You question traditions you know nothing about, girl. I question only who has the right to decide where another belongs," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving John's as she spoke. The hermit stood beside her, his presence a silent declaration. Though he said nothing, his stance spoke volumes. He would not allow her to face this alone. The elder's anger simmered as he dismissed the gathering with a curt wave. As villagers filed out into the snowy night, Martha approached Sarah with a small smile. "Some courage shines brightest in the darkest places," the healer whispered, squeezing her arm. Walking home through knee-deep snow, John and Sarah moved in companionable silence, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The challenge had been issued, and while the old man's displeasure would surely bring consequences, something had shifted in Pine Hollow that night, something neither tradition nor winter could easily bury. The first warm days of spring arrived with the gentle persistence of melting snow. Streams that had been frozen solid now gurgled with life, and tender green shoots pushed through the softening earth around John Smith's cabin. The world was awakening, shedding its white shroud for vibrant colors that promised renewal. While clearing space in his storage chest for Sarah's few possessions, John discovered a leather-bound journal he hadn't seen in years. The binding was cracked, its pages yellowed and water-stained at the edges. He recognized his brother's handwriting immediately. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing how still he had become. John ran his calloused fingers over the cover. "Something my brother kept, before he didn't finish the sentence." The pain of that loss had dulled over time but never truly vanished. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, John sat by the dying embers of the hearth and opened the journal. His brother's words flowed across the pages like a confession, tales of mountain prophecies, village secrets, and a child born during the worst blizzard in 50 years. A child spirited away to protect her from those who believed she was promised to the mountain. His hands trembled as he turned each fragile page. The journal spoke of birthmarks shaped like pine needles, of eyes that reflected starlight, of a destiny to bring together what had been broken. All signs that matched Sarah. She will return when the village needs her most, his brother had written. The one who protects her will restore balance to Pine Hollow. John closed the journal and stared into the glowing coals. All these months, he had believed chance had brought Sarah to his door. Now he understood it was something deeper, a thread of fate woven long before either of them knew the other existed. The following morning, he watched Sarah as she fed the goats, her movements confident where once they had been hesitant. She had grown stronger under his roof, but there remained a vulnerability in her that stirred his protective instincts. "You're staring," she said without turning around. "Just thinking," he replied. Sarah faced him then, brushing hair from her eyes. "About what?" John considered telling her everything, about the journal, about her possible heritage, about the destiny his brother believed awaited her. But fear held his tongue. What if the knowledge burdened rather than freed her? "About how protecting you has changed me," he said instead. The partial truth easier than complete silence. The hermit realized then that guarding Sarah had become more than a promise made in a moment of compassion. It was his purpose, perhaps even his fate. And for the first time in years, John felt the weight of isolation lifting from his shoulders. The spring festival brought color back to Pine Hollow after the long winter. Villagers hung ribbons from pine branches, and children chased each other through puddles of melted snow. Sarah Johnson stood beside John at the edge of the celebration, her fingers lightly touching the sleeve of his worn jacket. The peace shattered when 3 strangers rode into the village square on mud-spattered horses. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his chin, dismounted and scanned the gathered crowd until his gaze locked on Sarah. "There she is," he announced, pointing a gloved finger. "The girl who fled her obligations." John instinctively stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the newcomers. "Who are you to make demands in our village?" he asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "We're her kin," the scarred man replied. "She belongs with us. There are debts to be paid, bloodlines to be honored." Sarah's face drained of color. The young woman gripped John's arm, her knuckles white with tension. "They're lying," she whispered. "They're not my family." Elder Thomas pushed through the crowd, his weathered face tight with concern. "What debts do you speak of, stranger?" The outsiders spun elaborate tales of ancient promises and sacred oaths, claiming Sarah had been pledged to their mountain clan generations ago. Their words stirred the villagers' deepest fears about outsiders and ancient pacts. Martha Davis moved to stand beside Sarah, her healer's hands steady and calm. "The girl has found sanctuary here," she declared. "Whatever claims you believe you have should be settled without tearing her from a place where she's found peace." Robert Brown saw his opportunity. The blacksmith stepped forward, hammer still in hand. "We've all wondered about her past," he called out. "Perhaps these men speak truth. Perhaps harboring her endangers us all." John felt the weight of every eye in Pine Hollow. The promise he'd made by firelight echoed in his mind. No harm would come to her under his protection. Yet the village's fragile peace hung in the balance. "Sarah is under my protection," John finally said, his voice low, but carrying across the hushed square. "But I won't speak for her. She'll decide her own fate." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads at what they saw as weakness. The stranger's leader stepped closer, his boots leaving deep imprints in the spring mud. "You have no right to interfere," he growled. "She was promised long before she ever set foot in your cabin." Sarah stepped forward, trembling but determined. For the first time since her arrival, the entire village would hear her truth. The village square became a battleground of words and old grievances. Robert Brown stood tall among the gathered crowd, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest as he pointed an accusatory finger at John Smith. "We've tolerated the hermit for years," Robert declared, his voice carrying across the tense gathering. "But harboring this woman with mountain blood? She'll bring nothing but misfortune to Pine Hollow." The blacksmith circled like a predator, stoking fears that had simmered beneath the surface for generations. "Look at the symbols she recognized in my forge, patterns only those with cursed heritage would know. Will you wait until our children sicken or our crops fail before acting?" Several villagers nodded, their faces hardened by years of isolation and suspicion. The rivalry between Robert and John had festered since they were boys, but now it threatened to consume not just them, but Sarah as well. Martha Davis pushed through the crowd, her healer's bag swinging at her side. Age had bent her frame but not her resolve. "Shame on you all," Martha said, her weathered hands trembling with emotion. "Have you forgotten your own grandparents came to these mountains as strangers? That your ancestors were once called outsiders?" The healer's eyes swept across familiar faces. "Every family in this square has known hunger, loss, and the need for shelter. Yet you would deny another what was once given to you." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Robert was undeterred. "Pretty words don't change what she is," he countered. "John must choose his solitude or his guest, but not both, not here." John stood silent, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. The promise he'd made beside the fire seemed impossible to keep now, with the village turning against them. Then Sarah Johnson stepped forward. Gone was the trembling woman who had collapsed on a snow-covered porch. In her place stood someone transformed by months of kindness and hard work. "I have a name," she said, her voice quiet at first, then gaining strength with each word. "I have hands that can work, a mind that can learn, and a heart that knows gratitude." Sarah looked directly at Robert, refusing to be diminished. "I choose where I belong. Not you, not the elders, not even John." The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "I choose Pine Hollow," Sarah continued, "not because it welcomed me, but because it needs me to remember what compassion looks like." Her declaration hung in the air, a challenge, a plea, and a promise all at once. In that moment, the battle lines shifted, and the village faced not just a decision about one woman's fate, but a reckoning with its own soul. Raina Johnson adjusted her woolen scarf against the mountain chill as she arranged trinkets on her trading blanket. The village square buzzed with tension following the arrival of the outsiders. Their fine clothes and authoritative manner marked them as lowlanders, but it was their questions about Sarah that truly caught the traders' attention. With a jolt of recognition, Rena realized she had seen the young woman before. 3 summers past, while trading spices in the southern valleys, she had glimpsed Sarah through an iron-barred window of a stone manor. The girl had been dressed in finery then, watched constantly by stern-faced guards. A treasure indeed, or a prisoner. 5 gold pieces for information about the girl. The leader of the outsiders had whispered to her earlier, pressing a coin into her palm as a down payment. 5 more when we take her back where she belongs. The sum would buy Rena supplies for an entire season. With winter's hardships still fresh in her mind, the trader found herself calculating how many blankets, how much flour, how many medicines such wealth could secure. The temptation gnawed at her conscience. From her position near the edge of the square, she observed John and Sarah walking together toward Martha's cottage. The hermit's protective stance beside the young woman spoke volumes. Sarah's steps no longer faltered, as they had when she first arrived. She moved with purpose now, her head held high despite the suspicious glances from villagers. "They say she's mountain-born," muttered Robert as he passed Rena's stall. The blacksmith's eyes narrowed with disapproval. "Smith harbors her against our traditions. Elder Thomas believes she brings danger to us all." Rena nodded noncommittally, her fingers tracing the outline of the coin in her pocket. The outsiders had promised discretion. A simple word from her, and they would handle everything quietly. No one would know of her involvement. Yet as she watched John gently place his hand on Sarah's shoulder, steadying her as they navigated a muddy patch, Rena remembered her own arrival in Pine Hollow years ago. She too had once been an outsider, desperate and alone, until the village reluctantly accepted her. The trader closed her fist around the coin. 10 gold pieces could change her fortunes, but at what cost? The girl who had once been kept behind bars now walked freely beside a man who clearly cherished her presence. To betray that newfound freedom felt suddenly like a weight too heavy to bear. Rena turned away from the pair, uncertain if her conscience could withstand the gleam of gold when weighed against the price of Sarah's hard-won happiness. The village hall fell silent as Elder Thomas rose from his seat, his weathered face grave in the amber glow of the lanterns. The old man's voice carried across the room like thunder over the mountains. "Sarah Johnson is not just any outsider," he proclaimed, his finger pointing accusingly. "She is a bride promised by the mountain spirits, a sacred offering our ancestors foretold would return to us." Gasps rippled through the gathered villagers. Some crossed themselves while others nodded knowingly. The elder's declaration wasn't just superstition. In Pine Hollow, such pronouncements carried the weight of law. John Smith stood at the back of the hall, his hands clenched into fists. He watched as fear transformed the faces of people he'd known all his life. Robert Brown was already whispering to a cluster of men, their expressions hardening as they glanced toward Sarah. "This is madness," John finally said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "She's a woman who needed shelter, not some mystical offering." Elder Thomas turned his cold gaze toward the hermit. "Your cabin stands on sacred ground, Smith. The spirits guided her there for a purpose. The ancient rites must be honored." Sarah stood trembling beside Martha Davis, the healer's arm protectively around her shoulders. The young woman's eyes sought John's across the room, filled with a question he couldn't answer. Later that night, in the safety of his cabin, John paced before the hearth while Sarah sat wrapped in the wool blanket that had first welcomed her to his home. "What does it mean to be a bride of the mountain?" she asked quietly. John stopped pacing. In the old days, it meant sacrifice, a woman given to ensure good harvests and mild winters. He couldn't bring himself to explain further. And now? "I don't know. The old ways have faded but not disappeared." He knelt before her, his calloused hands taking hers. "I promised you protection, but I realize now that keeping you safe might mean something different than I thought." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "What do you mean?" "True protection isn't about locking you away or deciding your fate." John's voice grew rough with emotion. "It's about giving you the freedom to choose your own path, even if that path leads away from me." The realization struck him with painful clarity. His vow to protect her had become entangled with his own longing for connection, his own hope of finally belonging somewhere with someone. "And if I choose to stay?" Sarah whispered. John looked into her eyes, seeing not just the frightened woman he'd found in the snow, but someone who had grown strong enough to face whatever came next. "Then we face them together," he said, "but it must be your choice, not mine." The village gathered in Martha Davis's small cottage as the last echoes of the storm faded into whispers. The healer's hands trembled as she poured tea into chipped cups, her eyes never quite meeting Sarah's. John Smith stood by the window, watching snowflakes dance in the late afternoon light, his shoulders tense with anticipation. "I've carried this secret for 23 years, Martha finally said, her voice barely audible above the crackling hearth. "A young woman came to me one winter night, much like you did to John's cabin. She was in labor, terrified, and determined to escape." The healer paused, her weathered fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I helped deliver her child, a girl with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains. Then I gave them supplies and showed them a hidden path down to the lowlands." Sarah Johnson's breath caught in her throat. The room seemed to shrink around her as Martha reached for her hand. "That child was you, Sarah." The revelation fell like an avalanche upon the small gathering. Elder Thomas slumped against the wall, his authoritative demeanor crumbling as understanding dawned on his face. Robert Brown, who had insisted on attending, stared at the floor, the flames of his jealousy suddenly doused by truth. "Your mother was promised to the mountain in an old ritual," Martha continued. "She refused to accept a life chosen for her by others. I couldn't bear to see another young woman sacrificed to tradition." Sarah's tears came silently, streaming down her cheeks as pieces of her fragmented past aligned into a coherent picture. "All these years, I felt drawn to the mountains without knowing why," she whispered. "The lullabies, the symbols, they were in my blood." John crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her hand in his calloused one. The promise he had made in the firelight of his cabin to protect her, now transformed into something deeper, a recognition of her rightful place in this world. "The village cast out your mother," Elder Thomas admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of collective guilt. "We called her selfish, ungrateful. We never considered her happiness." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering old tracks and making way for new paths. The villagers exchanged glances, confronting their complicity in a history of rigid traditions and exclusion. "I'm not my mother," Sarah said firmly, squeezing John's hand. "And I'm not just a symbol or a lost child. I choose to be here." For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, Sarah felt truly seen, not as an outsider or a mystery, but as a woman with roots in this very soil, returning to claim her heritage on her own terms. The villagers of Pine Hollow gathered in the square as the morning sun cast long shadows across weathered faces. Elder Thomas stood at the center, his walking stick planted firmly in the ground like a judge's gavel. The entire community formed a circle around Sarah Johnson, whose eyes reflected neither fear nor submission, but a quiet resolve that had grown through seasons of hardship. "We must decide what becomes of the outsider," Elder Thomas announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "Our traditions speak clearly of those who come to us from beyond the pass." Robert Brown pushed forward, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his chest. "The ancient rites demand she either leave or pledge herself to the mountain," he declared. "There is no middle path." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Martha Davis stepped forward, herbs bundled at her waist, and placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "This woman has learned our ways," the healer argued. "She tends the sick alongside me and knows the songs of our ancestors. The mountain has already accepted her." John Smith watched from the edge of the circle, his weathered face betraying nothing of the storm within. When the arguments had exhausted themselves, He moved forward. The crowd parted, respecting the hermit's rare presence among them. "I made a promise to protect Sarah," John said, his voice steady despite rarely addressing so many. "But I will not stand in the way of her choice. She is not a symbol to be claimed or a right to be fulfilled. She is a person who deserves to choose her own path." Reyna, who had remained silent throughout, stepped forward unexpectedly. "I've traveled beyond our valleys," the trader admitted. "There are many ways to belong. Perhaps our traditions need not be chains, but foundations." Sarah moved to the center of the circle, her hands steady as she faced the villagers who had both sheltered and suspected her. "I choose to remain," she announced, her voice clear as mountain water. "Not as your prophecy or your bride, but as myself, Sarah. I found something here I never knew before." She looked at John, then Martha, then across the faces of those who had become familiar over changing seasons. "I choose Pine Hollow not because I must, but because I wish to." For the first time since arriving half-frozen at John's door, Sarah felt the weight of belonging settle upon her shoulders. Not as a burden to be carried, but as a gift freely accepted. The circle around her loosened, and one by one, hands reached out in welcome, rather than judgment. The seasons turned like a wheel, each bringing its own gifts to Pine Hollow. Spring wildflowers gave way to summer's abundance, then autumn's golden harvest, and finally winter's crystalline beauty before beginning anew. Through it all, Sarah Johnson and John Smith built their life together, their days marked by the rhythm of tending to their small herd of goats and crafting blankets from their wool. Their cabin, once John's solitary refuge, now buzzed with the voices of village children who came to learn the old ways. Sarah taught them to identify healing herbs, while John demonstrated how to read animal tracks in soft earth. The little ones listened wide-eyed as Sarah sang mountain lullabies, songs that now belonged to her by right rather than mystery. "You have your mother's touch with the young ones," Martha Davis remarked one afternoon as she watched Sarah bandage a child's scraped knee with gentle efficiency. The healer's eyes crinkled with pride, her earlier secret now a shared history that strengthened rather than divided. Even Robert Brown grudgingly acknowledged their place in the community when John helped rebuild the forge after heavy rains weakened its foundation. The blacksmith's suspicion had not vanished entirely, but it had softened into something closer to respect. "Your ironwork will outlast us all," John told him, and the simple truth of the statement bridged years of rivalry. Elder Thomas still maintained his formal distance, but he no longer spoke against Sarah at council meetings. When the village faced a harsh summer drought, it was Sarah's knowledge of hidden springs in the mountains that saved their crops. The elder had nodded silently when she spoke, his acceptance more powerful than any spoken blessing. Reyna returned from her trading routes with stories of distant places and small treasures. A carved wooden comb for Sarah, spices from lowland markets. "The world beyond the mountains asks about Pine Hollow now," the trader said. "They've heard we harbor wisdom here." In their home each evening, John found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed. Where once he had measured his days by solitary tasks and silent meals, now he counted them by shared laughter and the quiet conversations that stretched into the night. His vow of protection had evolved into partnership. His isolation replaced by connection, not just with Sarah, but with the village he had kept at arm's length for so long. The promise he had made by firelight, to keep her safe beneath his roof, had become something far more enduring. A bond forged through hardship and healing, as solid and true as the mountains themselves. One warm night, beneath a canvas of stars, Sarah Johnson and John Smith stood outside the cabin that had once been his fortress against the world. The mountain air carried the sweet scent of pine and wildflowers, a gentle reminder that even the harshest winters eventually yield to spring. Sarah gazed upward, her face illuminated by moonlight. a soft smile playing across her lips. "Do you remember what I told you that night by the fire?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the blizzard was howling outside and we thought we might not see morning?" John nodded, his weathered face softening as he recalled her trembling confession. The memory of her words, "I've never been kissed," had stayed with him through seasons of change, through village conflicts and reconciliations, through the slow transformation of Pine Hollow from a place of suspicion to one of acceptance. "I remember every word," he said, his deep voice gentle. The hermit who had once shunned human connection now found himself treasuring each moment with her. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. "I was so afraid then, not just of the storm, but of hoping for tenderness in a world that had shown me so little." The protective wall John had built around his heart had crumbled long ago, stone by stone, with each day spent in her company. He reached out, his calloused hand cupping her cheek just as it had that winter night when he'd made his vow to keep her safe. "You taught me something I never expected to learn," he confessed. "That protection isn't about locks and walls. It's about giving someone the freedom to choose their own path." Sarah leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own. "And you gave me the courage to make that choice, to stay, to belong." John leaned forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Their lips met in a kiss that held the warmth of 100 hearth fires, the strength of mountain stone, and the tenderness they had both longed for in their separate solitudes. When they parted, Sarah's smile rivaled the brightness of the stars above. Martha had been right when she told them that some bonds were written in the very rocks of the mountain itself. "This is what it means to come home," Sarah whispered against his shoulder as his arms encircled her. The cabin behind them, once a shelter against the harsh world, now stood as a testament to what they had built together. Not a fortress, but a hearth where hope and trust could flourish. Their love, like the mountain itself, would endure through any storm that came their way.